In General Elias's camp, Nino stood with a smoking revolver as Elias, the revolution's icon, fell, blood pooling from a golden bullet in his chest, eyes asking why. From a distance, El Chuncho, the leader who had once saved Nino from the shackles and led him through the days of war, rushed toward him, his eyes bloodshot. "Why?" El Chuncho roared. "Money," Nino said coldly, hand trembling. Once he'd dreamed of more, but as the trigger tightened his heart, that flicker of belief in El Chuncho's revolution died with Elias. The words struck like a hammer, severing his last bond with the comrades he'd betrayed. But now, General Elias lay there, motionless, and 100,000 gold pesos awaited him at the end of the road, but his mind was as empty as the desert stretching out beyond. Nino had once thought he could find a way out, a path that didn't lead to betrayal, but war gives no one the right to choose. It only forces people to decide, live or die. And he had chosen to live, even though the price was losing everything he had ever known. To understand why Nino stood here, his hands stained with blood, pockets full of gold, we must go back to the early days of the Mexican Revolution in 1915, where those who dreamed of freedom faced off against those ready to strangle it. The Mexican Revolution had entered its 5th year. Starting in 1910, farmers, workers, and the impoverished rose up against the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. But even though Diaz had been overthrown by 1915, the country was still engulfed in chaos. Factions fought for power. The government of Venustiano Carranza, backed by the United States, clashed with revolutionary leaders like Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, fighters for the land and freedom of the poor. But the revolution was not just about ideals. It was war, blood, survival. And in the midst of that line, men like Nino emerged. Nino, a Texas gringo named William Tate, lived by smuggling. From the age of 15, Nino survived by smuggling across the border. First liquor, then tobacco, and finally, guns. He had no ideals, no homeland. His only goal was simple: to survive and make money. In 1915, when Nino was 25, Carranza's government, through a hidden intermediary, hired him for dirty work, assassinating revolutionary leaders. This time, the target was General Elias, a loyal warrior of Zapata, who was leading the insurgent forces in the Sierra Madre. The reward, 100,000 gold pesos, enough for him to disappear and live out the rest of his life far away from this land of death. But to kill Elias, he needed a plan. Lately, the insurgents had been frequently ambushing government weapons supply trains, so why not use that to his advantage? Nino came up with an idea: disguise himself as a prisoner on one of the trains, wait for the insurgents to attack, and then infiltrate their ranks. A dangerous gamble. But if successful, he would have the chance to get close to Elias without anyone suspecting him. So, on that fateful day, he boarded the train in Chihuahua, his hands shackled with chains taken from the corpse of a dead soldier. In his pocket, a golden bullet, a lucky charm he always carried with him. If the plan failed, there was no plan B, only one inevitable outcome: death. The scorching heat of Chihuahua in August 1915 enveloped the cargo train, with black smoke billowing from the engine like the breath of a giant black snake. Nino lay on the floor of the last car, his hands shackled, part of his cover. He lay there, breathing steadily, eyes half closed, but in his mind was a complete plan: infiltrate the rebel forces to get close to General Elias, the target worth 100,000 gold pesos from the Carranza government. This train, filled with rifles and ammunition from Chihuahua to Durango, was a tempting prize. Nino was certain the revolutionaries wouldn't let it slip by. The sound of the wheels on the tracks suddenly slowed, then came to a sharp stop, almost sending Nino tumbling off the rotting wooden floor. "Why are we stopping?" a soldier shouted from the front car, his voice muffled by the desert wind. "There's someone on the tracks!" the driver yelled out, poking his head out. Nino squinted through the car's crack. It was a skinny man, raggedly dressed, tightly bound to the tracks with rope, his eyes frantic as he stared at the train like a desperate plea for help. Lieutenant Ferreira, a young man with blonde hair and panic in his eyes, rushed out from the command car shouting, "It's a civilian! Is he alive? Unbind him!" Two soldiers, Giamo and Gomez, jumped down, rifles in hand, heading toward the man. "I'm Juan, from San Pedro Village," the man shouted, his voice hoarse, trembling. "They tied me up to stop the train. Save me." But before Giamo and Gomez could cut the ropes, a sudden burst of gunfire ripped through the air from the other side of the train. Not just from the hill as everyone had expected, but from the dry trees by the tracks, an angle no one had anticipated. The gunfire sounded like a swarm of angry bees, bullets slamming into the side of the train, piercing through wood and metal. The government soldiers on the train returned fire, shooting wildly at the hill, but they didn't realize the enemy had surrounded them on both sides. Giamo collapsed next to Juan, blood spurting from his chest, his rifle falling to the ground. Gomez turned around, shouting, "They're on both sides!" But a bullet pierced his shoulder, causing him to stumble, clutching the wound with a groan of pain. Civilians screamed as bullets flew. A government soldier near the engine yelled at the driver, "Run over him and keep going! Don't let them get on the train!" The driver trembled, his hand on the controls, but Ferreira shouted back, "No! He's a civilian! Save him first!" The lieutenant's hesitation lasted only a few seconds, long enough for the rebels to charge down from the hill, their bandanas flying in the wind, their screams drowning out the cries of the children. El Chuncho jumped down from his black horse, his eyes blazing with fire, a scar across his cheek distorting his cruel smile. His revolver swung up. A flash of light, then a government soldier collapsed, blood splattering onto the crates behind him. "Drop your weapons or you'll all die." The rebels flooded onto the train like a pack of wolves. No hesitation, no mercy. The driver knelt, trembling, raising both hands. A dry shot rang out. His body jerked, then fell to one side, a streak of blood quickly spreading across the wooden floor. In the civilian car, a rebel grabbed a man by the collar, rifling through his tattered jacket. Rusted coins fell to the ground. He sneered, "Useless." A flash of light from the barrel of his gun. The victim collapsed like a shadow lost its form. Nino crouched behind a broken cargo car, his hand silently picking up a rifle from the body of a fallen soldier. In the distance, a government soldier lunged toward Juan, the prisoner still tied to the tracks. Nino squeezed the trigger. The sound of metal clashing mixed with the chaos. The soldier staggered, then collapsed. Not because he sided with the rebels, he needed to play his part in this act. His wrist throbbed, the skin torn from the pressure of the cuffs, but it didn't matter. Pain was part of survival, as always. He glanced toward Juan. The man was still thrashing, shouting, "Let me go! I didn't do anything!" No one cared. A sharp, clean shot rang out. Juan's head snapped back, motionless. Amid the gunfire, Nino saw a child, no more than 5 years old. It crawled out from the civilian car, its small hand gripping the edge of the door, eyes wet with tears, lost in the battlefield. "Mom!" Its voice broke through the chaos. A rebel stepped across, stepping on the child's hand. A dry, cracking sound echoed. The small fingers twisted under his weight. The child screamed, but the rebel didn't look down. He just kept firing. Ferreira, near the engine, screamed, his voice breaking, "Stop! Spare the child!" No one listened. El Chuncho chuckled softly, spinning his revolver in his hand, glancing at Ferreira as though he had just heard something meaningless. "War spares no one, Lieutenant." Nino had seen violence before, but this scene surpassed anything he had ever imagined. This was pure destruction. The rebels didn't just want weapons. They wanted to burn everything else down. But the government soldiers were no innocent party either. Trains like this one were often given orders to slaughter villages, burn down homes, and steal land from people like Juan, or the family of that child. Both sides were bloodstained, and now amidst the smoke and the dying screams, Nino saw it clearly. It was all meaningless. It was all for their own gain. A shadow flashed before him. It was El Chuncho. His revolver was aimed directly at Nino's head, his voice low, his gaze dark. "Who are you?" Nino looked at him, not blinking. No hesitation. "Nino." His voice was calm. "Wanted by the government. I'm being taken to El Paso. I want to escape." Chuncho squinted. He looked down at Nino's wrist, where the steel links of the cuffs glinted in the firelight. "With your hands cuffed? How can you shoot?" Nino shrugged, raising both hands and smiling faintly. "Easy, it's what I do." El Chuncho laughed loudly, but his eyes were cold. "You've got guts, kid. Want to live? Come with us." Nino stood amid the wreckage. Plan succeed as he joined the rebels, but the child's crushed hand stabbed his chest. Money bought this. The revolution's blood drowned any light he'd once glimpsed. The first night in the cave between the hills of Chihuahua, Nino sat by the fire. watching El Chuncho and his men inspect their spoils: 60 old rifles, cracked wooden stocks, and rusted barrels. Each one's worth 30 pesos. That makes 1,800 pesos in total, El Chuncho calculated, his voice eager. Divided by 15 men, each gets 120 pesos. Nino smirked. Not much. We need machine guns. Those are worth more, El Chuncho replied, slapping him on the back. If you want to stay, you'll have to fight for the revolution. Nino nodded. The revolution broke my chains, right? El Chuncho laughed loudly. I am the revolution. But Santo. The priest in the group, with blonde hair and eyes full of conviction, whispered to Nino later. El Chuncho doesn't know we sell guns for money. He thinks we're fighting for General Elias's ideals. Land for the poor. Freedom for Mexico. Nino looked at Santo, a slight smirk on his lips. I like money. In the weeks that followed, Nino traveled with them across barren fields and ruined towns. They ambushed Carranza's rurales, stealing rifles, ammunition, and sometimes food. El Chuncho spoke of General Elias with a fiery look in his eyes. He's the man of the revolution, leading us to a day with no hunger. I fought with him in Zacatecas. You should have seen that, Nino. But Nino stayed silent, the memory of the train attack still haunting him. He had once thought the rebels were just bandits, but El Chuncho's passion, the way he shared the last piece of dry bread with his comrades, made him begin to question. Adelita, the only woman in the group with long black hair and sharp eyes, once asked him by the stream on a night, "Why are you here if you don't believe in the revolution?" Nino shrugged. To survive. But every time he shot a government soldier, every time blood flowed through his hands, he wondered, was this a war for justice? When El Chuncho sang revolutionary songs under the starry sky, his voice hoarse but full of life, Nino felt something unfamiliar stir in his heart, a sense that perhaps they weren't just killers for money, but people who truly believed in something greater. El Chuncho's hoarse songs of freedom stirred Nino. Hadn't he once wanted that too? However, what he had witnessed on the train didn't fade away. It clung to his mind like the smell of gunpowder on fabric. Once they attacked a village occupied by the rurales. Gunfire rang out, shadows falling. But it wasn't just government soldiers who collapsed. Nino saw an old farmer desperately holding onto the rope tied to his cow. The rebel opposite him sneered, drawing a knife. "Cooperate, old man!" The blade sliced through the air. Blood splattered onto the brick wall, spilling onto the cracked earth floor. The farmer collapsed, eyes wide open, his hand still clutching the rope. El Chuncho shrugged, his eyes empty. This is war. But Nino didn't respond. He turned away, a knot forming in his chest. The revolution wasn't as clean as the song suggested. History is written by the victors, with the blood of both enemies and the innocent. When the group arrived in San Miguel, a small town in Durango that had just risen up against the government forces, El Chuncho cheered, "The people have killed all the soldiers. Tonight, we celebrate." He stayed behind, teaching the townspeople how to hold a gun, how to shoot, as if handing them power instead of weapons. "This is a Mauser. Open it, load the bullets, aim, shoot." Nino stood on the sidelines, watching with a look of discomfort. "Why don't you give these guns to Elias?" El Chuncho shook his head, his voice firm. "San Miguel needs me. If we leave, Carranza's army will come back and turn this place to ashes." But Nino wasn't concerned. He didn't have time to wait for another war. He approached Adelita, who was tying her shoelaces by the fire. "I want money. I didn't come here to become a saint." She looked up, sighed, her tired eyes as if she had already expected this. "I'm tired of riding horses and waiting around too." Nino walked up to El Chuncho amidst the laughter of the villagers, his voice calm but decisive. "Give me my share of the guns. 30 rifles and 4 boxes of ammo." El Chuncho looked at him, his eyes momentarily disappointed, not because he was losing a comrade, but because he was losing something deeper. "You're a gringo. You don't care about Mexico. So leave." He paused, glancing at the bright faces around the fire. "But look at them. Poor, hungry. Yet they're people like us. No one will fight for them." Nino didn't answer, just turned and walked away with Adelita, Pepito, and a few others, taking 30 rifles and a machine gun they found in the town's supply store. As they walked, he glanced back at El Chuncho standing amidst the poor, the thin women holding children, the old men trembling with guns, and a brief doubt flashed through his mind. He had once thought the revolution was just an excuse for bloodshed, But El Chuncho's gaze, the hope in the people's eyes, made him wonder, had he made the wrong choice? El Chuncho was right. The government forces returned, killing everyone with a gun, and the innocent too. When the news reached Nino on his journey, he remained silent. San Miguel was now nothing but ashes and bodies. El Chuncho survived, but the town did not. San Miguel burned to ashes was not his fault. Guilt gnawed at Nino, but money won. After all, only money lasts. Nino headed to Elias's camp. Pepito, a small but reckless man, often sang revolutionary songs to pass the time, but his voice faltered when they were ambushed by the rurales, government soldiers in green uniforms, as ruthless as the rebels. "Machine gun, Nino," El Chuncho shouted as he caught up with them, riding his horse with fire in his eyes. He had discovered they had taken the machine gun, the very one he had planned to leave behind for San Miguel. Rurales ambushed them. Eufemio, the large but slow man, was shot in the back while trying to drag Pepito to safety. Adelita screamed, her voice breaking, then ran into the darkness, leaving Nino and El Chuncho in the midst of the gunfire. They survived, but barely. Nino held the machine gun, firing until the barrel was red hot, while El Chuncho used his revolver to take down the rurales with terrifying precision. When the battle ended, they stood amidst the dead, gasping for breath. "What the hell do you need the machine gun for?" El Chuncho growled. "To sell," Nino replied, his voice as cold as steel. "San Miguel needed it, don't you know?" El Chuncho shouted, desperation and anger in his tone. Nino merely shrugged, his eyes unwavering. "They're dead. Guns don't save anyone." El Chuncho looked at him, his gaze a mix of rage and pain, but said nothing more. They moved on, the two survivors dragging their feet through the desert, carrying the machine gun and a few crates of ammunition. The destination was near, Elias's camp, where Nino would complete his mission. But with every step, every glance from El Chuncho, it felt like a slow knife slicing into his mind. Nino justified his actions with the memory of the train, the cruelty of the rebels, the hopelessness of the government soldiers. Everywhere was blood, everywhere was death. If everything was just an endless cycle, could he ever truly escape? General Elias's camp lay deep within the Sierra Madre Valley, hidden behind towering cliffs like a natural fortress. When Nino and El Chuncho arrived, they were greeted like heroes. At least El Chuncho was. He handed over the machine gun, received 5,000 pesos from an officer, his eyes gleaming as though victory was now within reach. But General Elias did not look at him as a hero. The tall man, his hair streaked with silver dust, spoke in a voice deep as a rock rolling through a chasm. "San Miguel was slaughtered because they didn't have guns." He paused, his gaze piercing straight into El Chuncho. "Do you know you've profited off the bodies of your own people?" El Chuncho lowered his head, his voice trembling. "Shoot me then." Santo, his brother, with his blonde hair and eyes full of conviction, stepped forward, gun in hand, ready to carry out the order. But before that could happen, Nino seized the moment. He drew his revolver, shooting Elias in the chest. The gun recoiled violently in his hand as the golden bullet, the lucky charm he always kept for the most important task, flew out. A loud bang echoed through the air. Elias fell, blood spilling from his mouth, his eyes wide with shock as he looked at Nino. "Why?" El Chuncho roared. "Freedom's a bullet away," Nino said, stomach twisting. Was this the cost? He had thought killing Elias would be simple, just another target to eliminate. But as Elias collapsed, Nino saw the faces of El Chuncho, Adelita, and the people of San Miguel. In that moment, he realized he had betrayed not only them, but a part of himself. The part that, even if briefly, had believed in the ideals of the revolution. Santo shouted, "You're with the government!" But El Chuncho stopped him, his red-rimmed eyes locked on Nino. "Go," he said, his voice rough. "Go, damn you!" El Chuncho rasped, eyes full of pain, but Santo lunged toward Nino with a cry. Nino sprinted, the sound of gunfire ringing in his ears, clutching 5,000 pesos and the promise of more. In Ciudad Juarez's dusty haze, Nino took his 100,000 gold pesos, the Carranza officer smirking. More leaders to kill? If the price is right, Nino shrugged, suitcase heavy in hand. At the Morelos Hotel, El Chuncho burst in, gun raised, eyes blazing. "Why'd you kill him?" "Money," Nino said, flat. "And you saved me for it." Chuncho's hand shook on the trigger. "Gold can't buy a man's soul, gringo." He fired. Click, empty chamber. A bitter laugh escaped him. "Keep it! Choke on it!" He tossed the gun at Nino's feet and stormed out, shouting, "Don't waste that blood money!" Nino stared at the gold pile, the golden bullet rolling from his pocket. Freedom's price stared back, cold, hollow, victorious. He had joined the revolution to get close to Elias, swept up in El Chuncho's ideals and San Miguel's struggle, only to betray everything for gold. The Mexican Revolution, with its promises of freedom and land, turned out to be nothing more than a ruthless cycle of blood, money, and betrayal. Nino stared at the gold. Freedom's price, he thought, but it buried the man he might have been.